All right, let's set up our Neovim configuration from scratch. I know from experience that even though using Neovim as an IDE replacement and can be effectively a fully fledged IDE is way more efficient, your productivity is going to improve dramatically, but at the same time, your first configuration can be a little bit of a nightmare. I know that from experience from when I first set up back in the day Vim and then later setting up Neovim, and getting your configuration right will take time. But what I want to do today is I want to take a step-by-step walkthrough on how to set up your Neovim configuration, how to install Neovim, how to set up the configuration, how to install TMUX, how to get TMUX working with Neovim, and then how to use the Lazy Nvim plugin manager to get all the plugins to give you a good foundational base. I'll make a second video where we get into even more advanced options with using AI engines like Codium, for example. But what we're going to be doing today is we're just going to have a really, really nice UI and very clean experience in our Neovim configuration, and it will be a great foundation for you to add in the languages that you want to work with. I'll do Python and I'll do Lua as examples so that you get a feel for how you can add additional languages. And then I'll also, in a follow-up video, have a tutorial on how to set this up with Windows Linux. First thing I want to point out is this is a fresh install of Pop! OS. If you're not familiar with Pop! OS, that's okay. Pop! OS is based on Ubuntu, and this version in particular, 22.04, while somewhat out of date now, I'm using deliberately because that is the same version at the time of recording that's running on the Windows subsystem for Linux, the same version of Ubuntu. So I'll just quickly show you that. If we go and have a look at this specific OS that I've just installed on this machine, you can see it's Pop! OS, but Pop! OS is based on Ubuntu, which is obviously based on Debian. But what we're really concerned about here is this is the version 22.04, over a year old at this point, and that's okay because we're going to come across, I've done this deliberately because we're going to come across versioning issues. We're going to have to install Neovim in a slightly different way, not using the apt package manager that's available with Ubuntu. If you're using Arch Linux or any other platform, you may be able to use standard routes, but in our case, we want to use Neovim version 0.9.2, which at the time of recording is the latest stable version. Just wanted to give a brief introduction. The only things that I've installed on this machine are on the right hand side, we've got Brave browser. On the left hand side, we've got Alacrity. Alacrity is a terminal emulator. I highly recommend it, and I'm going to leave the link to it in the video description. So if you would like, you can go ahead and install it, but ultimately you can use whichever terminal emulator that you prefer. Doesn't matter. So having said that, we want to have at least version 0.9 so that all the plugins that we're going to work with are going to marry up. There's not going to be any issues with respect to versioning and so forth. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to install 0.9.2. If we were to install Neovim using apt Ubuntu package manager, it's going to be, I think it's version 0.7. In any case, it doesn't matter, it's too old. We want at least version 0.9. So I'm going to show how to do that. On the right hand side, I'm at neovim.io. This is obviously Neovim's homepage. And when you visit this page, there'll be an install now option available. Let's click on that. All right, and then there are instructions here if you're running Windows or you're running Mac OS. So if you are running those systems, go ahead and use that. As I mentioned, I will have a follow-up video which will take you through setting up Neovim with your Windows subsystem for Linux. All right, so just scrolling down a little bit, we'll get to the Linux section. Now, I normally use Arch Linux, but I've done this, so I know that Ubuntu is a very popular distribution. It's quite user and beginner friendly, particularly Pop! OS, which has a very nice UI. So a lot of you who are new to Neovim may be using that. All right, so in here we can see that there is a way that we can download directly from the Neovim GitHub the app images, and basically these are just the compiled binaries that they've got nightly release versions. We're interested in the stable version. The time of recording, as I mentioned, it's 0.9.2. So what we can do is, if we have a look here, and by the way, have a look down at the bottom. If you're running Arch, it's somewhat easier. Just run sudo pacman, the package manager for Arch, and then Neovim, and you'll get this installed. If not, if you're like us and you're running some kind of derivative of Ubuntu, then we can have a look at this one. In here, we've got a curl command, and then in that curl command, we up to the Neovim repository, and then we can see we've got the latest, and then we've got the downloadable app image. It's very important always copying stuff, copying commands and so forth, that we know exactly what they're doing. So curl is a utility which is for, basically in this case, we're using it to download a file from the internet. We're passing it two options. One is L, it allows redirects. The other one is O. That means let's output this to a file, print it out to the screen. All right, so we can enter that into a terminal. You can do this anywhere. I'm in my home directory, or we can just have a look actually. So here I am in the home directory. We're going to be, it doesn't really matter where you do this because we're going to do away with files and so forth, but it may be easier to follow along if you're just in the home directory. You can do that by cd, change directory, and then the tilde, that represents your home directory. Then when you go pwd, it'll tell you where you are in the home directory. All right, so let's download this file. There we go, it's done. And now let's have a look at this file. So we can see that we've got this file that we've just downloaded, and it's only got read-write permissions. So the owner of the file and then the groups that are associated with that file, they only have read-write permission. So what we want to do is we want to be able to execute this file, because in Linux, when we want to execute a binary, we might do something like this and then say nvim.app image. But at the moment, we're going to get permission denied. The reason being is we haven't set execution permissions on the file. All right, so how do we do that? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We use the sudo command for escalated privileges because we're going to be applying this execution permission. And then we use chmod and then +x. That stands for execute, and then followed by the file name. All right, so let's do that. Now, when we run the same command as did just a moment ago, we are presented with the Neovim opening screen. And as I alluded to earlier, version 0.9.2, so we want to be working on at least 0.9 upwards. And we've got it available in our system. By the way, you can exit by using :Q. That's often, for beginners, can be a little bit of a nightmare getting out of Neovim. And by the way, if you're not that familiar with Linux and with Vim, it's okay, just play along. In a moment, I will turn on the keys so you can see the keys that I'm pressing and so forth. It is important that you get the hang of Vim if you're going to be using Neovim, because all of the Vim motions still apply. All right, so now that we've got this, just want to talk a little bit about executable binaries. So Linux, most distributions come with a whole bunch of different utilities. And for example, echo is one that you might be familiar with. All that does just echoes onto the output, just printed out hello world. But if you notice, we don't prefix echo with // because it's in a path that our system is smart enough to know to look up, right? So we want to do a similar thing with our Neovim binary. So what we're going to do is we're going to once again use sudo, because we require escalated privileges to do this, and we're going to move this file and we're going to put it into this directory. It's USR, which is Universal System Resources, then local bin, and we're going to call this file or this binary nvim. All right, so just done that, it'll prompt you most likely for your password. For me, I just entered my password earlier, so there is a timeout on that. So now you've shifted it in there. If you go and have a look in the directory that you're in, you'll notice it's no longer there because we've used the move or mv command to shift this into a directory where our system by default would look for executable binaries. All right, so now if we go and use the which command and we say which nvim, you'll see, okay, that's the location of our Neovim. And now we can actually just run it just like we would echo. we can see it's the same opening welcome screen that we had earlier. Now we didn't have to prefix our file // we didn't have to change into the home directory where we downloaded it. And so now we've installed our Neovim. Congratulations, you've got Neovim installed on your system. It's pretty raw out of the box, and we want to make a lot of additions to improve the general experience, but you've managed the first step. So just before we get into the next steps, so we're going to be setting up TMUX, and we're going to be setting up Neovim configuration, as well as installing a Nerdfont, which is a requirement to get some of the icons and so forth to display correctly in Neovim. One quick thing, and this is optional, is that old habits die hard. I have come from Vim, and so I'm used to using Vim or starting opening files, for example, like this. And then, of course, now we've got Neovim. So what I am going to do, I'm just going to alias the Vim to Nvim so that we can use either one of those commands and it'll reference the same program. So let's just do that. So the way that you would do that, you would use your Nvim and you would go to bash rc. Because I'm using derivative of Ubuntu, it's using bash by default. You might be using zish or something else. You can just go to the rc file for the option that you're running with. All right, and then so down the bottom there are some general aliases. If we have a look down here, okay, so this seems to be kind of a general one. This distribution's come with a whole bunch, and so we simply just write alias vim equals nvim, and then that's just going to mean that when we run the vim command, we're actually running the nvim. We can exit that with wq, so it writes it, and then we can source that file with. And now, if we run vim, we get Neovim. All right, so we've installed Neovim. Now we're ready to install the plugin manager. The plugin manager that I'm going to use is lazy.nvim, and at the moment, this is one of the most popular, if not the most popular plugin manager. It's got excellent UI for managing our plugins. It caches or keeps a lock file, so when you use it on different machines, it'll make sure the versions of all your plugins are the same. It's quite straightforward, especially once I've taken you through this and shown you everything. So we're going to be using Lazy Nvim. I'm of course going to include the link to this in the video description as well. So we're going to set that up now. Every configuration file is going to be written in Lua. Typically, all of your configurations with respect to Neovim are going to be written in Lua. Don't be intimidated because Lua is an extremely simple language, very straightforward, and so all the live coding you should be able to follow along if you know any other languages like JavaScript or Python or any other scripting languages. Let's get started. The first thing we want to do is we've already set up, or we've already installed Neovim, and now Neovim by default looks into a certain directory and it will look for a set of files, and that can be init.vim or init.lua. In our case, as I mentioned, we're going to be using Lua as the language of choice for the configuration. And so the spot that we're going to cd into our home, and then the directory is called .config. And in here, you're going to have a bunch of existing configurations for other programs that you use. I already mentioned Alacrity, you can see up there on the top left-hand corner. And so there's going to be a bunch of others. So we want to make a dedicated directory for Neovim. And so what we're going to do then is we're going to use a make dir command, and then we will call this directory nvim. Neovim is then going to look into this directory by default, and it's going to look for this file, which we're going to create. We can use that using the touch command, or if you're using bash, you can also do it like this. And we're going to call that init.lua. So we can have a look in this file, and pretty bare bones. We don't have any line numbers. We don't have any color scheme. Obviously, this is not a replacement for an IDE. We want to exit out of there. Just wanted to point out that Neovim sources this file, and so this is going to be the entry point for our configuration. However, Lua is set up in such a way that it will look into the Lua directory in this project. So let's go into, made a mistake there and I created the init.lua in the config. So let's move that into the nvim directory. So we just move, and then we can say nvim, and we can put it in there. Now let's cd into our nvim directory, ls, and we can see that the file is there. No problem. All right, so what I was saying is that Lua will look for a Lua directory and all of the files for your Lua configuration we want to keep inside that Lua directory. So let's make a Lua directory. And then what we want to do is we want to, because we want to have a well-organized code base, we want to create a directory structure that corresponds to the different plugins and the different configuration items, and also a utilities directory for another kind of catch-all, any utility functions that we create to help us out during this configuration. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to make 3 new directories in the Lua directory. And so we do this using this syntax just to make it a little bit quicker. So inside Lua, we want to create first of all, we want to create a config directory. Then we also want to create a plugins. That's where we're going to keep all of our plugins. And then I'm going to create another one that we'll use later on, which is called util. And we can just keep a few basic utility files in there. All right. So now when we ls in our Lua directory, we'll see this basic directory structure, config, plugins, and util. And we've got init.lua. Right now, none of this is doing anything. So the next step is to install Lazy Nvim. So we come here to GitHub. This has got over 7,000 stars. Another popular plugin manager is Packer. Or if you're using a vanilla Vim configuration, you might be using something like Plug. At the end of the day, you can still achieve the same results, just that Lazy is good because it, by virtue of its name, it gives away the fact that it does allow for lazy loading, so it'll only load the plugins when you use them, if you set it up correctly. And as I mentioned before, there's a few other benefits. All right, so there some installation instructions. And typically what I do is I leave my init.lua file in the root of the nvim directory. I leave that just as purely the entry point, and I don't put any logic in there. I like to isolate the logic where it's taking place. So what I'd like to do here, which is the installation, and I'll talk through that. Let's create a file, and it's going to be in Lua, and it's going to be in config, and it's going to be init.lua. Now let's go into that directory, or we don't even need to change into the directory. What we can do is we can simply say vim lua config init.lua. So we've got this blank file init.lua, and it's in the config directory, which is inside the Lua directory. Now what we're going to do is we're going to copy across this script. All right, so what this does is it, on the first line here, it looks up to see if Lazy is installed. Then it says, okay, if there's nothing, or rather it looks at the path to where Lazy would be installed. Then it says if there's nothing in that path, then let's go to GitHub. In this case, it's using Git. It's going to clone from GitHub here, and then get the latest stable branch of lazy.nvim and install it. Okay, so that's done. But we haven't actually set it up yet. So we've installed it, or we've got a script to install it, but we don't actually have anything calling it. So what we're going to do is the next step, which says that, okay, you need to, in order to invoke Lazy, you need to call it in this way. So we've got require Lazy, and then we've got plugins, which we'll get into, as well as options. Okay, what I'm going to do is just look down a little bit here, and you'll see that there is this slightly more verbose configuration. And what this does is it includes some basic plugins from the same author. One of those, which key allows for, it gives you shortcuts. So when you press the spacebar, it'll give you a summary of the available shortcuts. Can be quite helpful for beginners. And also neoconf and neodev. And these can be quite useful when developing our Lua Neovim configuration. They give us more support and can be quite useful. So I am going to use this second option here, and I'm going to paste that in there. As we did before, so we can call :wq now, and we're back. But let's just say if we go to back in our Nvim directory, if we go to our init.lua, which is the entry point to our configuration, we can now call this, which is require. This is a keyword in the Lua language, and that just says that we're going to require a certain file or import that file. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say config here. Now, because we called the file in the config directory init.lua, we don't actually have to have any additional path here like init or anything. If we did call that something like some people you may see call that lazy, and therefore you would need to also have config.lazy. But because we've called it init.lua, it's smart enough to just look in the config directory in the Lua directory and simply start that. So let's write and quit. All right. Now the next time that we open init Lua, you'll see this nice UI that I alluded to earlier, and it is installing those dependencies. Well, it's first of all down the very bottom, you'll see it's installing lazy.nvim, and then it's also installing these 3 plugins that I mentioned, which are from the same author, and they're going to make our lives a little bit easier. Looks like previously I had some installed items, so what we can do is we can do capital S sync, and it'll get rid of those for us. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to exit out of that. And the first thing typically that I do is I will create or give this Neovim configuration a color scheme. You can choose whichever color scheme that you like. The one that I like typically is called Night Fox, and so just follow along with that, but you'll find it's extremely easy to install your own color scheme. All right, so the way that we do that, and the reason that I do that is because we want to start building out our plugins directory, and the color scheme is generally the easiest plugin to install. The first thing we're going to do is we are going to go into our Lua plugins, and we're going to have a new file. And generally what I do is I will call the plugin, or would name the plugin file in a way that it corresponds to the exact name of that plugin. So it's easier to reason about when you come back to it in the future. You'll be able to say, okay, Night Fox, oh, that's the color scheme. And so it's just a naming convention, because all of these plugins in this directory are going to get automatically loaded by Lazy. So as I mentioned, the color scheme that I like is called Night Fox. So I'm going to call the file nightfox.lua. All right, and we can just go here and we could just have a look for that. All right, so this is the color scheme. There are a few more iterations. If we come down here, you will see an example of a lazy installation for Night Fox. So we can simply copy that. So now this is our first Lua file that we're really kind of writing ourselves. It's quite straightforward. So if we create a table using these curly braces, then we can return that from the file. And what we can also do in here is, because we're a color scheme, we don't want lazy loading. So we want this to always be loaded, because by virtue of the fact that it's color scheme, it's going to be available from the moment that we open Neovim. Priority by default is 50 in Neovim. So what we would want, given that most files are going to be 50, we want to give it a really high priority, which will then ensure that it's loaded before everything else. So typically I'll give it something like that. And then each one of these Lua plugins, and they may be instantiated in different ways, but in the case of the color scheme, they will take an argument, and it's called config. And basically config, it gets called every time the plugin gets loaded. And it can be a function or it can be a table. In this case, I'm going to make it a function because we're going to do some things in there. What we're going to do is we're going to call this vim.cmd, and I'm going to say color scheme Night Fox. Right? So if you have your own color scheme that you like, then you can put the GitHub URL in up the top, and then down here you can simply change that to whatever it's called. Then that will load the color scheme that you like. So let's write and exit out. Great, but just for the moment, that's not quite being loaded yet, because we haven't actually sourced that anywhere. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to Lua config init.lua, because this is where we're invoking lazy. And in here you're going to see we've got these packages that we spoke about earlier, and they're being directly sourced here. But the thing is that we are going to have many plugins by the end of this. So this can get quite messy. So what I'm going to do is I am going to delete everything there. And I am going to say, okay, plugins, that's the directory that we want lazy to look in. Now, let's quit out and let's go to the Lua plugins and let's create an init.lua there. It's going to install the Nightfox color scheme, so that's been done. So you see the color scheme has changed. And in here, I'm going to return. So I pasted from the register within Vim. All right. So because these are standard plugins, what I will usually do, particularly those second two, I will put these in a directory called init.lua because they're just closely tied to the Lazy Nvim plugin manager, and so they don't necessarily warrant their own dedicated file. You could potentially extend this for other very vanilla or basic plugins. I don't usually, but that is an option. Remember, all of the files in this directory are going to be sourced by Lazy Nvim. All right, so let's write and exit out of that. And I do use the which key plugin, and I use it separately. So let's go and we'll go to, we're going to call this which key.lua. And in here, we're going to return, and we're going to open a table, put in the which key. We already had this installed, so the next time that we go into Vim, it's not going to install that, but nonetheless, we've now got a cleaner directory structure. And if we list out all of our plugins, we can see, okay, we're starting to build out here a list of our plugins, and it's quite easy to reason about because we've named it in a certain way. All right, so we've installed a color scheme, we've installed Lazy. Now we're on to the point where we can really start configuring our whole Neovim configuration. It's going to be very easy at this point to add in plugins. Before that, just a few items that we're going to set up that are outside of the plugins. They're more native to Vim, and we'll get those done. Hang in there, we're getting pretty close to writing this thing up. We've got a few housekeeping items that we are going to sort out first, though. As you can see, I'm back into the .config.nvim or config nvim directory, and in front of you is the same GitHub link to the Lazy Nvim repository, just a little bit further down under configuration. Here you'll see all the default configuration items, and you don't need to load all of these in, but there are a few that we may want to override. One of those is defaults lazy. By default, plugins are not lazy loaded. We want to set this to true, and then in files that we don't want to be lazy loaded, that is to say files that we want to always be immediately loaded and not until the point in time that they are actually used, we will set that to false directly in the plugin settings. An example of that is the color scheme. So obviously we don't want lazy loading. We set that to false for Nightfox, which is the color scheme that we're using here. That's the first item. The second one is install. So we will just update the color scheme here because they don't have the same color scheme as us. If you're using a different one, you can put the color scheme in there as well. Moving on down a little bit, there's also some disabled plugins. Disabled plugins, this is mainly an issue because we're going to be installing new plugins and they may conflict with some of the default plugins that are loaded by Neovim. So we're going to disable all of these by default, and then we're going to be installing our own plugins. This just ensures that there won't be any conflicts between the respective plugins. Finally, I'm going to set a notify on change detection. I'm going to set that to true, which it is by default. But later we'll then set that to false, because once we get comfortable with our Neovim configuration, we won't need to be notified of every single change. So we're going to set notify to true, keeping in mind that later we'll set that to false. We're going to do all of this in that file where we're configuring lazy. So if we go to Lua config init, that's where we were doing that. And so what we're going to do is, you see there is the options path, and I've just copied in the items that I've just talked to you about. So defaults lazy up here is, we're setting that to true, updating the color scheme, disabling these plugins, and we are saying, okay, for the moment we want change detection to be true. We're going to set that to false later. Then we're passing that in as the second parameter into the lazy setup function. Okay, you may recall that in the install guide, it was recommended, or required rather, that you need to set up your map leader before you set up lazy. And generally I do this in a separate file called globals, because the map leader is a global setting. So what we're going to do is we can create a new file. We can use E, which stands for edit, and we're going to put this in the Lua config globals.lua. That's going to open up this new file, and then we are simply going to say vim.g, which is global map leader, and the map leader is going to be space by default. Typically most people use space. You can use whatever you like. And then I'm also going to set the map local leader, just to be safe, also to space. All right, so we can simply now require that rather than including it in this file. And actually we need to prefix that with config.globals. Now the next one that I'd like to do is some native options to Vim, and we're going to use the Vim opt API. And that is a high-level Neovim API that allows us to change some of the default settings of Neovim, but without actually installing any plugins. This is something that we can do ourselves. We create a new file, and we're going to call that Lua config, and then we're going to call that options.lua. Okay, so we're in our options.lua file, and we're going to set some options using the vim.opt high-level API. The way that we can do this, and just to make things a little bit cleaner so we don't have to keep writing vim.opt, is generally I will declare it as local opt, and that is equal to vim.opt. All right, now the first thing that I'm going to go through is tabs and indentation, and we're going to make some basic changes just so we get a more consistent experience. So the first one I'm going to use is called tab stop. Now what tab stop does is it sets the number of spaces of a tab character, how many spaces a tab character it takes up, and we're going to set that to 2. The next one we're going to say shift width, and shift width is it sets the number of spaces for each level of indentation. It's also going to be 2. The next one is going to be soft tab stop, and we're going to set that to 2 as well. This, when we're in insert mode, it says how many spaces is a tab when we are in insert mode. At the moment, you'll see I just hit insert, for example, and it's quite a lot of spaces. So we're going to be setting that to 2. The next one is going to be expand tab. So expand tab converts tabs into spaces when we open a file. Moving from maybe Windows to Linux or something like that, this can be important. So we set that one to true. Then we have smart indent, and this is basically just allows for auto indentation. And the last one that I'm going to set in here under tabs and indentation is going to be wrap. And that one I set to false, because if we have long lines, then we don't want those lines to start wrapping under. If we've got code that extends beyond the edge of our view, typically I like that to just let it go beyond the edge of the view. If you're ever in a markdown file or you're reading some text, you can always set like that, and then you will then set wrap, and that so there will be cases perhaps where you will want to allow wrap. So that is tabs and indentations. The next one, I'm just going to do some search items. And so with search, we've got incremental search. And the good thing about incremental search is it will just, as you increment your search or add letters to your search, then it will highlight all the matches associated with that. So I call that is true. Then we typically want to ignore cases on by default. The next one we're going to have is smart case. So smart case, where you do use capitalization, it will then try to detect, it will say ignore cases to begin with, but then where there is capitalization, we'll start using the capitalization as part of the search. So I will set that to true. And the last one is highlight search. And I just like to have that to false. Right, so that's our search items. And then we've got some appearance. This is where it starts to get perhaps a little more visually interesting. First one is I like to have relative numbers on the left-hand side of the screen. Then term GUI colors. Basically, all that does is it just allows full color support in the terminal. It's required by some plugins. Next, we have a color column. What that is we are going to set column where we're going to insert a line, and what that is it's saying, okay, giving us an indication of how many characters our text is. If it hits that line, in this case, it's going to be 100. Sign column. The reason that's good is if we've got a debugger running or anything like that, it will keep a gutter and it will keep the necessary space available so that even if there is an insertion of, say, a debug icon or something like that, you won't see a change in the width of the text. And then we want numbers. In fact, we'll put that up here just to be more orderly. Next one is up to you, but the command height. So down the bottom, when you have colon, that's going to be 1. Scroll off is when we are searching up and down the screen. If it gets within 10 lines of the bottom, it will then start scrolling rather than hitting the bottom. All right, so this is kind of an interesting one. This basically, we've got a few options that we're passing here, and it goes through to auto completion. But basically, define how the completion menu will behave. Menu 1 means that it will show if there's only one item in the completion menu. No insert means that nothing will be inserted by default, and no select means that nothing will be selected by default. So those items are kind of going into the appearance category. Then we're going to move down into behavior. Later on, we're going to get into buffers, but one item that we have is hidden. It's a bit confusing, but hidden, basically, by setting this to true, we can change buffers without saving. So I turn off the error bells. It can be annoying. It literally makes a noise whenever you make an error, so I will turn that off. There's no swap files. I typically don't have them available. I also set backup to false. That just means that there's going to be no swap files, there's going to be no backup files. Undo dear, so we do want undos to be saved and available. And you can set this to anything that you like. So we want an undo file to be made available. Then we just want to, next I'm just going to change the behavior of the backspace, and that's just so that it works on indentation. It's also end of line and start. Then when we're splitting the terminal windows, I want it by default to be right, or so if we're splitting it vertically, as in we've got two vertical panes next to each other, then we want it to be new panes to be added on the right. And then if we add them horizontally, then we want the new pane to appear at the bottom. This means that we're going to automatically change the directory that we're in, and we don't want that. Next, I typically like to consider words to be, even where they're hyphenated, to be full words. So if we're deleting a word and it's separated like that, then we want to ignore that sign and simply treat that as a whole word. So the way that we do that is we simply say is keyword end, and then just add this option. Now we've got, by adding mouse, appending it, we are appending it in all modes. So insert, normal, visual, the mouse will always be available. Unnamed plus just means that we are going to add the register plus to the clipboard, and then that allows us to copy and paste between outside of Vim and inside Vim. Modifiable, I have it automatically set to true, just means that you can edit the buffer that you're in. By default, is true. The next one, GUI cursor, is basically gives visual representation to your cursor. The next one, GUI cursor, this just basically changes the appearance of your cursor. I'm going to paste in the settings from my personal GitHub, and that's going to be available in the link. And then finally, we've got the encoding, and all that does is it just says that the encoding for the buffer, the current buffer that you're in, is going to be set to UTF-8. All right, let's exit. Now let's go back into one of our files using Vim, and we can see, all right, we've got these line numbers, relative line numbers that can help us move. If we wanted to move 6 down, then we can simply do that. Now we've got a reference available. We also have tabs, and there are 2 spaces. And overall, you will see as we go on that a lot of the configuration items that we made in there, while relatively mundane, were nevertheless important. If you ever want to get a feeling for all of the available options, you can see the set all, and this will give you a list of all of the available settings that you can include in that options file. Of course, definitely take it upon yourself to educate yourself on what additional options you may find helpful and see what other people have in their configuration. Sometimes I will also use the options, and in here we can see we've got all of these different settings, and as well as the exact syntax for setting them. When you come from a normie IDE, then you're really used to having a file directory tree on the left-hand side of the screen ordinarily. I know, and even though I don't use it really anymore, I do tend to like having it there, especially on larger screens, because it gives me a feel for whereabouts I am in the project. The most popular tree or file explorer in Neovim is the Nvim tree plugin, and so we're going to install this. Basically, it's just going to set up this nice file explorer. It's going to be by default on the left hand side. We can pass it some very basic options, and we can explore those, or you can explore those more in your own time if you want to customize it later on. But generally speaking, this is quite a nice plugin. The first thing that we're going to do is we are going to just have a look in our Lua config init, because one of the first things that is recommended in this plugin is to say that you should disable netrw and netrw plugin. We spoke about that a little bit earlier when we were setting up Lazy. I've included both of these already. Just make sure that you have disabled those to be included those in the disabled plugins list. Term GUI colors, we also included in the options.lua file earlier, so we don't need to do that. All right, so now what we can do is we can go to our plugins, and we're going to create a new file. It's going to be called nvim.tree.lua. And in here, just like before, we're going to return a table. And that table we're going to include, the first thing we're going to include in here is the link to the GitHub, so it knows where to download this from. All right, the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to include lazy as false. And the reason is because we want this to load. I just get it to load every time that I open Neovim. And then finally, I want to set a config. Now with config, it behaves in 2 ways. If you can pass a function as we did earlier, or for example, if you don't need to invoke any special commands in here, you can simply pass a table here as well. And what will happen is at the time that this plugin is opened, this table will be passed into the setup function. So you can imagine here that we've got require nvim tree setup. So what will happen is that any config items that we include here are simply going to be passed into that setup function. I don't really typically make too many changes to the defaults here. You're welcome to investigate in your own time on any additional defaults. The only one that I do typically include is filters, and I say .files. Now let's just quit out and then go to our Lazy, and it's going to install Nvim tree for us. And if we quit here, you can see now that on the left hand side we have folder structure, and we can see all of the files. It's not looking great because we don't have a Nerdfont installed, and we're going to do that next. That's why you're seeing some of these Chinese characters. But fundamentally, this is the file explorer, and we're going to add icons, and we're going to fix up the Nerdfont so this doesn't look so strange. But for the moment, that's been set up for us. We now have a situation where we have these icons, these Chinese characters displaying instead of what should in this case be a file icon. Well, we can see that this isn't limited to Nvim tree, because if we call lazy, we can see in here that there are, for example, some additional Chinese icons here. The reason for this is that we don't have a Nerdfont installed. So I'm going to take you through installing a Nerdfont and then setting up the Nerdfont with the Alacrity terminal emulator. Right back at the beginning, I mentioned that I am using Alacrity as a terminal manager. So this example will be given in Alacrity, but you'll be able to find examples for whichever terminal emulator that you've chosen to use. If you do want to follow on exactly though, what you can do is you can install Alacrity. If you're on a system like Ubuntu or Pop! OS, then you can simply run the command sudo apt install Alacrity. Now, I've got it installed already to the latest available version with Ubuntu 22.04, but for you, it'll prompt you for your password, it'll then install it. Then we'll be able to say which Alacrity, just like we do with our Nvim file, we can see that we've got it installed. In a moment, we're going to go through the configuration, but that's the first step. So this here on the left-hand side, just to be absolutely transparent, is the Alacrity terminal emulator. That's what I'm using, and you can follow along there. All right, so we have got Alacrity installed, and this is the GitHub, by the way, for Alacrity. On the left-hand side, it gives you instructions on how you can install this. You can build it from source. Up to you. I'll leave this link in the description. It's more for reference than anything else. Then what we want to do is we need to install a Nerdfont. So as I mentioned, we've got these Chinese characters being rendered because our font that we're presently using does not support those characters like file icons and so forth. We need a Nerdfont, which is a font which has a broader set of characters, and a lot of those are in fact icons, and those icons are then rendered in the terminal or wherever the Nerdfont is used. This is primarily used by developers in IDEs and so forth. There are other benefits to Nerdfonts. What we need to do is we need to download our Nerdfont. So we can do that by going to nerdfonts.com, then going to downloads, and we've got a list of Nerdfonts here. Given that we're trying to install a font which will be rendered correctly in the terminal, we are restricted to mono fonts. You'll find that if you install one of the fonts that is not a mono font, then some of the characters will go beyond the scope of their character, and they may look a little bit funny, they may overlap and so forth. So we want to choose a font which is a mono font, and you can choose any one of these that you like and follow along the instructions. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. One of the more popular ones is Firacode, and as you can see here, we've got the Fira Mono Nerdfont. One of the ones that I like is Mononaki. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that I find to be quite a nice font. And so we're going to install this one here for this example. So the way that we do that, we just do an old school click and download. Of course, I will leave the link in the description of this video, and then we can put this zip file into our home directory or wherever we've been working on this. In my case, I've just simply been working out of the home directory. We can save it there. Then we can have a look at that file and open it up with our archive manager and extract it. And what we need to do is we need to create a new directory in the home directory, and it's going to be called patched fonts. So we create that, and we're going to extract out our font into this patch fonts directory. Okay, great. So if we have a look in here, we can go to the patch fonts, cd into the patch fonts just to see what we've got there. And as you can see, we've got all these files: Mononaki, Nerdfont, bold, italic, and so on and so forth. So, and we've got mono, which is an important thing to mention here, because we discussed this is not going to work correctly in the terminal emulator if we haven't got the mono version. Great. So
We've got this patch font directory and we've extracted out the font that we've downloaded in there. Now what we need to do is we need to go to the Nerdfont's GitHub repository. It's hosted by this guy, Ryan Oasis. It's a really, really popular and large repository. And in there is there's an install script. So nerdfonts install.sh, and you can read through it yourself, but effectively what this does is it's just going to grab any of the fonts that you've extracted into that patch fonts directory, and it's going to install these fonts, which typically in Linux systems are going to, or at least in Ubuntu and Pop! OS, is going to be stored in local share fonts, and we can have a look at that a little bit later. What we can do, I've just copied that whole script, the raw script. I'm going to cd back into the home directory, and I'm going to create a new file which is called install fonts. And we're going to go into this file and we're going to paste in that script that's available on the GitHub that I've just copied. Similar to when we first started this and we had to make the Nvim binary executable, we also need to make this install fonts file executable. So we can do that by using that same chmod command. Now what we can do, we can actually install or run this bash script, and it will install the fonts that we've got available. So the Monarchy font has simply gone and it's created a local share fonts Nerdfont directory. We're going to have a look in there in a moment, and it's just moved all of these Monarchy nerd fonts into that directory. So let's just go and have a look. So here we've got this directory nerd fonts, and in there we can see we've got those fonts available. So now we're not quite done, but we're getting very close. If you have installed Alacrity, then this next step is going to be easy to follow along. If not, look up the specific configuration for the terminal emulator that you're using. What we need to do is we need to go into our .config directory. This is the same place where we have our Neovim config, but this time we're going to go and see if there's an Alacrity directory. Now, you may find that because this has just been installed, you don't have an Alacrity directory in the .config. So what you can do is you can simply make a directory called Alacrity. I'm getting an error because we already have that created. I did that at the start when I installed it. So I'm going to cd into that Alacrity directory. If you've just created the directory, you will need to create an alacrity.yml file. I already have that. So let's go and edit that file. I've already got two settings. One of those is opacity 1. At the moment we've got no transparency in our terminal emulator. Towards the end of this, we will install a plugin that's going to support transparency so that we can see through to the background. The other one that I've got is decorations none. That just takes away the top bar. That's a matter of personal opinion if you like that. The next step is that we want to adjust the font configuration in Alacrity, and the way that we can do that, I'm going to paste in configuration, and this will be available in the GitHub. But essentially this Alacrity config allows us to set the font for the different styles here, and I'm going to save that and using :u as we know, which is right, and you'll notice that immediately the Alacrity picked up this font change and has applied that nerd. Now if we go to our tree, Nvim tree, and we can simply toggle this, we can see we've actually got all of these file icons, and no longer do we have any Chinese characters showing up. Or we can even have a look in here and we'll see that, okay, Lazy has loaded the correct icons as well. So that concludes the Nerdfont installation section. We can navigate between our file and our file explorer Nvim tree by using the colon, which stands for entering command, and then in here we can use the focus, open, and that is great, but it isn't ideal because we don't want to every single time have to read out that command. So what we're going to do is in our config, we're going to add another file. Do that by pressing A, and then in here we're going to call it keymaps.lua. We can open that by pressing enter, and in here we are going to add some keymaps. Over the course of this video, we're going to add a few more keymaps in here. We're going to also add in keymaps to the plugins directly. The reason that we want to add in key mappings in the plugins directly is that then they would only be loaded at the time that that specific plugin is loaded. But if you recall, when it comes to Nvim tree, we've set lazy to false because we want it to load as soon as we start Neovim. So in that case, it's okay to include in here the key maps associated with Nvim tree. I typically only use 2, and I'm going to demonstrate how we can set these. So the first thing we want to do is we want to the key map API, much like we've done in the options and the globals. I'm going to assign this to a local variable just for conciseness so that what we're working in, and I'm just going to call that key map, and it is pointing to vim.keymap. And then we can create a comment in Lua with the double dash, and then I'm going to just call this directory navigation, just so that we can reason about exactly what each of these are doing as we add more shortcuts. In this case, what I normally use is I will focus on the file explorer and also toggle the file explorer if I want to hide it, or if I don't want to see it, if it's taking up too much space on the screen. So those two commands are nvim tree focus and nvim tree toggle. We can look at all of these if we press colon and then nvim and tab, and you will see a list of all the different nvim tree commands, and you may find that you more, but in my case I typically only use 2. So let's set those 2 key maps, and they're both going to be made available in Vim's normal mode. So when we're in insert mode or when we're in visual mode, we're not going to have these key bindings, and that is important because let's say we are in insert mode and we've used our leader key, which if you recall was set to space, then every time that we press space in insert mode when we're inserting some text or code, it's going to start looking for shortcuts. So it's important to narrow down the modes that we're in. We can do that very easily with this key map API and the set method attached to it. So we can call this keymap.set, and then the first argument that it takes is the mode. In this case, we just have n for normal. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, what is the shortcut that we are going to use? And what I will typically use is leader, and then in the case of focusing, I want to be able to press M, so space M, and that will focus me onto File Explorer. The next argument is the actual command. This looks like colon, which opens us into command mode, and then nvim tree focus. We end that with an opening bracket and then CR, which stands for carriage return. And then we can also pass some options. These options, no remap, so that it won't get remapped. And the other one is silent, so that we won't get any feedback in the terminal. We don't really need to be notified about this. Copy this using YY, which will yank the current line, and then we can paste it using P. Now I'm going to replace on this line, instead of space M or leader M, I'm going to call this F. And this is actually going to toggle the file explorer. So let's go and we will change this command to toggle. And there we have it. Use :WQA, which is going to write quit all. Okay, just before we can get this shortcut working, what we need to do is we need to require our keymaps file in our init config. So let's go to vim lua config init, and just where we've done globals and options, we can also require the config.keymaps. Let's quit out of that with WQA again, So now this time, when we go into Neovim and we're looking in the directory, we can open up any file. In this case, I'm just going to open up init Lua. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press space M. And you'll see that the cursor has shifted from the file into the file explorer. And we can then also toggle this off. So by space F, and we'll see that the file explorer is gone and our cursor is now focused back in the file. So congratulations, you've set up your first keymaps, you've imported them, we're going to expand on them, but it will make your life a little bit easier. Just while we're here setting up our keymaps, let's also add a few for navigating between panes. At the moment, there's no quick way to shift between the file on the right and the file explorer except for using the leader M, but sometimes we might actually have two panes. We could get that, for example, by using command split. Now we've got two files, but I can't move up and down between them. So let's add another section which is going to be for navigation or pane navigation. And this will purely be about navigating between panes. I'm also going to add some window splitting. This will allow us to have more panes, so we can split this into two without using the split command. So in this case, we can split vertically, we can split horizontally, and we can also minimize or toggle minimize. Now, when we're back in, I've just re-entered, and so we can simply move using Control H and L up and down. We can use space SV, that'll give us a split terminal, or space SH. And you can see using Control J and K up and down, left and right, we can navigate between all of these. One of the go-to plugins that I install in every single configuration is Telescope, and Telescope is a fuzzy finder that allows you to quickly search through your project or from the directory structure that you're in into any files, either by file name or also using a Rust built grep tool, which will grep through all of the code or all of the text in that project directory and allow you to look up files based on their content. So this is incredibly useful and is quite common in VS Code, where people will often open the files that they're working on by quickly searching for them by name rather than by looking for them in the file explorer, which we have been doing until now, which can be quite slow. Now, if you want to install Telescope, which I highly suggest that you do, you will need to install this additional tool, which is called ripgrep. It says here that it's a suggested dependency, but in fact, if you look at this built-in function, livegrep, it does require ripgrep. So this is something that I use quite a lot, and therefore I'm going to suggest that we install ripgrep. We can do that, and I've already done that by using sudo apt install ripgrep. I've already got the latest version installed. I did that just before I started this recording. However, if you run that command, you'll be prompted for your password. It'll then install ripgrep, and that will ensure that the livegrep, which looks through all of your files and greps them, just like with any other plugin, what we want to do is we want to go to our plugin directory, and then on the right hand side of the screen, we've got the Telescope GitHub repository. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to paste in the setup that I use, and then I'm going to walk you through it. So we can simply add a new file by going to the plugin directory and then hitting the A key. I'm going to call this telescope.lua, and in here I'm just going to paste in the configuration that I use. So this is fairly straightforward and it doesn't deviate much from the defaults. It does, however, change the theme. So for find files, livegrep, and also find buffers, it uses this theme called dropdown. you can play around with the documentation and different options with respect to themes. Then I also just set 2 key bindings in here, which is Control-J and Control-K. That will allow us to move up and down all the search results that we have. Down the bottom, we are returning this plugin in the same structure that we did with the other plugins that we've installed. So this is the route to install that from GitHub. It's got a tag which refers to the specific branch version. I'm putting lazy false because this doesn't need to be loaded until we actually use it. And then it does have a dependency which is a common dependency amongst Lua configuration plugins. We've got a config which was declared above, and in addition to that we've also got this keys. So earlier we saw that we can set keys in the keymaps.lua file, and that's what we did with the Nvim tree, so that we could toggle the file explorer on and off and so forth. There is also the option to set the keys directly in the plugin. Typically I will do this when I've set lazy to false, because I want these key mappings only to be available when that plugin is loaded. And another benefit of this is that you will have the key maps easier to reason about, given that they're in the plugin. They're directly in the file associated with that plugin. We have a few options here. So we've got FK, that shows us our key maps, and we've got FH, which is help tags. I don't use those two too much, but they can come in handy sometimes. The 2 or 3 rather that I use quite a lot are the find files here on line 42, live grep, then also the buffers, which can just show us all of our buffers. If you run lazy, you should see telescope should install, and so should plenary, because as it points out here, this is a dependency and telescope is using it, therefore it's been loaded. Alright, so let's just simply exit that view and demonstrate some of the benefits of this. So if I want to find a file, I can use leader F, and that will say find files. And then I might say, okay, what was the key maps? I can simply type in here key maps, and then this will show us or allow us to quickly access our Keymaps file. Then the next one is FG, and because we've installed ripgrep earlier, this is going to work. We might say, okay, what was our color scheme? And it's Night Fox. This is not looking at the file names, rather this is looking at the contents of the files, and so we can quickly go to that search result that we've just found. The final one, and I'm going to explain this more a little bit later, at least to some extent, so that you have an idea of how Vim handles buffers. But if we do FB, we can get a list of our buffers in here. And of course, we set the shortcuts for Control-J and Control-K so that we can move up and down between search results. So we've got 2 buffers open at the moment. I will discuss it later on in this video. Next, let's set up a bunch of standard, pretty small, but nevertheless useful plugins. I'm going to put this in a category called general plugins. We're going to move through this fairly quickly. The first one that I'm going to include is comment.nvim. I find this really helpful. It basically just allows us to use shortcuts to comment lines of text or blocks of text. So this is the GitHub repository once again, and we've got instructions with Lazy Nvim on how to install this. We can create a new file with edit, and then the path to where we want this new file to be in the plugins. And then in this case, we're going to just call this comment.lua. We can paste in these instructions, ensure that you're returning this table from our file. And I'm not going to override any of the default options. If we now load this, and we can do that by using this source and then sourcing our init.lua file, which we know is in the config, and then in the nvim and init.lua. Now if we look in lazy, we will see, okay, we've got comment. Comment is not installed, so we can use Shift-I and install comment. And now we can say lazy reload load comment. All right, so we've done that, and now I can just show you, before we've set any key bindings, exactly that if we were to use the key binding in normal mode, GCC, we will now be commenting things out. And if we want to uncomment things, we can do GCC as well there. However, I ordinarily think that that's a little bit too verbose. I map this to control /. I think I've picked that up from one of the other IDEs, and let's do that now. So we can use our fuzzy finder, that's leader FF, and we can look into our keymaps. You can copy these from the screen or otherwise from the GitHub repository, but in this case, we've got in normal mode and also in visual mode. If we use control and then this underscore, which actually represents the / in this case, we're actually going to be calling this GCC, which refers to the comment Nvim command, and that will comment out the line. I'll just show you that. So if we were to now hold control /, that will comment the line, and we can also get whole blocks like we did just then, and we can uncomment that. All right, the other little key map that I did also include in here was for indentation. Here, if we use shift and then the greater than symbol, then we can indent, use our indent formatting. If we don't set this key map to less than GV or greater than GV, then we will end up with a situation where in fact we would do a greater than symbol, and then the visual mode would be lost, and we'd be back here. We'd have to then select everything visually to do that. So this is simply 2 additional shortcut groups, the indentation and then also the comments that I've added. The next plugin that I'm going to include is Indent Blank Line. Indent Blank Line gives us a nice visual representation of the indentation of our code blocks. Specifically, code is quite useful. The way that we install this one, it's quite straightforward, but here just showing to begin with that we have no visual representation of our indentation. So let's create a new file once again in the Lua plugins, and then we're going to call this indent blankline.lua. Just going to paste in the options or the setup instructions. They've got them down here for your reference. Save that file. We can then source our config nvim init.lua file, and when we go to lazy, we should now see that indent blank line is here. It's not yet installed, so using shift I we can install it. Now it's installed, but it's not yet loaded, so we can simply use lazy, and then lazy has a bunch of different options. One of those is load, and we can then load indent blank line. So let's go back to the original file that we were looking at, and now you will see these lines represent the indentation. Next, we're going to install Nvim Treesitter. Nvim Treesitter is a syntax highlighter. It's going to parse the code and give better syntax coloring and highlighting to give a better readability experience. We can once again add this in. I'm going to call the file in our plugins directory nvim treesitter.lua. Now, in this case, we don't actually have a lazy configuration straight out of the box in the documentation here, but we know from experience now making the adjustment to lazy is quite simple. I've got an example configuration here that I use. It is important to note that these ensure installed means that Nvim tree will install all the syntax highlighting for these languages, but you can adjust this list depending on the languages that you use. Then I'm simply going to pass that into the same pattern that we've been using, where we pass the GitHub URL. We're going to lazy load this as false, meaning that it's always going to be loaded. Makes sense because we're always going to be looking at code. And then config, we're simply going to pass in this config function that we've declared up the top. I've also set enable true to auto tag. That's important because in one of the next plugins that we add, we're going to be having auto tag closing, and it does rely on Nvim Treesitter. So let's source our init.lua file. Then let's have a look at lazy. We sync this, we will see that we've got Treesitter now installed, but it is not loaded. Let's load it. We can do that with lazy load, and then down the bottom we've got Treesitter. So it may not be immediately apparent when using this, but they do have an example on their website where they've compare the two against each other, and you can in your own time check that out. You will see that you definitely do have nicer syntax highlighting and better colors once you've installed Nvim Treesitter. Next up, we've got Nvim TS Auto Tag, which helps us to automatically rename
tags and their associating end or closing tags. For example, straight out of the box, Neovim, if we were to rename this div, would not rename the corresponding closing tag div. And so we'd have to go and find that ourselves and then rename it. And the same would apply for P or many other tags. This is using Treesitter to auto-close and auto-rename HTML tags. And it is somewhat helpful if you work with any front-end frameworks or with vanilla HTML. I'm going to create a new plugin file and we're going to install Nvim TS Autotag. The way that we're going to do this, as usual, is with Lua, and then we're going to go to the plugins directory. I'm going to call this Nvim TS Autotag, and if we have a look down into the configuration, we can see some examples of how to install this, although there isn't a specific example given for Lazy Nvim. So I'm going to use the default configuration that I ordinarily would use. We're using Nvim TS Autotag, that's the GitHub URL. We're not going to lazy load, so we want it to always load by default, the same as we're doing with Nvim Treesitter. Recall that by passing this empty table or a table with any configuration options, this is the same as calling the setup function, because lazy is going to provide that table to the setup function. And because this actually depends on Nvim Treesitter to work, we're going to add a dependencies table in here, and this will ensure that Nvim Treesitter is always loaded before we load Nvim TS Autotag. So if we were to say CW, which is change word, and we might change this to be section, all right, and it is working, as you can see. So that is a helpful plugin, especially for front-end developers. When we look at our file explorer, we've got these icons that we gained by installing the Nerdfont, but they are still kind of a bit too vanilla, and we can spruce this up by adding in a plugin called Nvim Web-Devicons. It's super easy to install. We don't have a lazy configuration here, but it doesn't matter because we know how to convert this into lazy now. So in the plugins, I'm going to create this new file. We're going to make it consistent with the other files, so it's going to be called Nvim Web and then devicons.lua. In here, we want to use the GitHub URL. So if we paste this in here and be sure to return the table, we've got the same URL as the plugin. And now you can see we've got example HTML has an HTML5 icon. Lua is all now represented by these Lua icons. We've got a JSON file here. And so for all the languages that you use, you're going to see, the React symbol, you're going to see Python, and so on and so forth. So there's similar plugins in VS Code and so forth, and this just does the same thing to give you some nice icons. When there's multiple instances of a word or a variable in a file, this plugin, Vim Illuminate, will help us to get a visual representation of that by highlighting all the instances of the word that is currently under the cursor. I'm going to install this. There isn't an example for Lazy Nvim once again, but we can easily convert it into a Lazy Nvim plugin. So let's add a new file, Vim Illuminate, into the plugins directory. And I'm just going to paste in the configuration. So in this case, it actually doesn't call setup, it calls configure. And we've got the default configuration available in the documentation there on the right-hand side. I don't make any changes to the default configuration. I find that it is totally fine the way it is. Let's exit out of Vim and then go back in, which will, as we know, install Vim Illuminate, and it's ready to go. So go and have a look. Say probably the best example so far has been the Keymaps file. Now, when we hover over Keymap, you may be able to see that all the instances of Keymap are now slightly highlighted. And so it's easy to make a visual reference to any of the instances of Keymap in the file. Although not necessarily the biggest plugin, this is one of my favorites and is especially good for beginners coming to Vim. It highlights the text that you've just yanked or copied into a register if you're new to Vim. This can be a great visual aid just to justify or ensure that you have copied the right text. Let's add it in. This is the configuration in here, the GitHub URL, setting lazy to false. You can find more information on this plugin, but as I mentioned, it is pretty minimal, albeit quite useful. Just installed it, and now let's quit out of that. Let's go to one of our files. Perhaps we can go to our init file, and let's say we wanted to yank everything within this function. So we would say yi inside that, and you can see it's just flashed green to represent, okay, we've just copied everything in there. Otherwise, we can copy a line in Vim using the YY to yank the line, and you can copy a whole file by using the command : and then y plus. It'll copy the whole file for you. To wrap up our general plugins category, we're going to install noise.nvim, and this is a plugin which is going to make the visual command line and give us messages as well. It is, by its own admission, a highly experimental plugin, and it is going to replicate a lot of the inbuilt UI for messages, command line, and pop menu. Use it at your own discretion. We're going to add it in here, and we're going to simply call it noise.lua as usual. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in a example that I use. We do have in here some instructions with respect to using installation with Lazy Nvim. So we can copy this, but at the same time, I have found down the bottom here with this nvim notify that it will throw an error when using transparency, which we're going to get into later if we don't use this require notify and set it up with this background color as follows. Up to you. Let's quit out and then let's open. We'll see it's going to then install noise as well as its dependencies. Now, if we do things like write a file, then we are going to be presented with a message, or if we simply want to open the command line, we're still using the same command, it's : but now the command line is presented there in front of us. If you find that this is a little bit too much, what you can do is you can use the fuzzy finder, go back into that noise file, and you may find that quite often we may want to simply disable this nvim notify. That's an optional plugin. And so if we were to go back in now and say, do the same thing as what we did before, write a file, we're just going to be given a notification as per usual down the bottom of the screen. It says here in the documentation that nvim notify is only needed if you want to use the notifications view. If not, they're going to use mini as the fallback. So it can be a little nicer sometimes when working on a smaller screen like I am in this video, not to have those notifications popping up everywhere. But if you do have a larger monitor, then perhaps you may want to enable the nvim notify. In Vim, I don't ordinarily use tabs, and that's because there's a concept called buffers. Buffers are a space that text exists in and can be edited and ultimately written to files. And at any given time, you may have any number of buffers available that you can switch into. This will make more sense as we go on, but if we open Vim and then we go to any file, when we open that, we'll have at least one buffer open. We can see our available buffers if we use our fuzzy finder that we had before. For example, we can use leader FB, which was a key mapping that we mapped, and in here we can see the list of available buffers, and if we had more than one, we could move around and select another one, which would then take us to that specific buffer. The problem is that if we haven't got any kind of visual representation of these buffers, we always have to list out the buffers, and it can be hard to keep and reason about the amount of buffers that we have available to switch between. What we're going to do is we're going to use this plugin Lualine, which more than handling buffers also gives us a nice visual status line at the bottom of our view that will show us many things, such as the get status, the Vim mode that we're in, like normal or visual mode, as well as all kinds of other information, such as the buffer. We can also adjust Lualine to give us a list of all the buffers, and it'll make more sense once we've installed it. So why don't we do that now? We can add that new file, and actually what this does is it creates a new buffer just for reference, about given that we've just learned about that. So Lua, and then we're going to do plugins, and we're going to call it Lualine nvim.lua. And in here, I'm just going to put in an example, and we're going to update that with the color theme that we're using. In here, I've got some settings that we're going to use later that set the background to nil, because we want to have transparency set up later on. So if you want to include transparency, then do include that option. Then we're passing in the theme. I've set this global status to true because I only want to have one Lualine. In each individual pane, if we'd set this to false, we would have a new Lualine. Next, in these sections, we've got the ability to list our buffers similar to the way that we would tabs. You're going to see in a moment that all of the buffers are going to be listed on the left-hand side. And this helps us to reason about which buffers we're moving between. Finally, just as per usual, we're going to return this in a table and then set it all up. So let's install that by exiting and re-entering, and now we've got that Lualine installed, and you immediately see down the bottom that we have some new visual aids. And if we open a file, we're going to see, okay, we're in init.lua. This is the format of the file. You can see the language. You can see that we're in Linux, which is represented by this icon here, the penguin. All right, and now if we were to go and open another file, for example, which we could do with our fuzzy finder, let's go to the Keymaps. Doesn't matter which file it is. All of a sudden, at the bottom, you'll now see two buffers represented. So we've got init.lua that we were just in, and we've got keymaps.lua. If we hold down Control O, which is a native Vim key binding, we're going to go back into the init.lua buffer, and Control I, then we're going to the keymaps.lua buffer. This just takes us back and forth to where we just were. However, if we want to specifically move between buffers, what we can do is we can use colon, and we can say BP, that's buffer previous, or colon BN, and that's buffer next. We can also use the fuzzy finder, as I just showed earlier. We can say leader FB, and in here we can switch between our buffers, and that can be quite useful. We're making progress. We've got our Neovim set up with a file explorer, a fuzzy finder, syntax highlighting, bunch of other plugins, and it's starting to look pretty good. We can navigate our buffers as well. However, we haven't taken advantage of language server protocols, and this is where IDEs really shine because you get great feedback in the editor when you're editing the code, and you also have debuggers, linters, and formatters. I'm going to set up 3 languages, Lua, Python, and then TypeScript, and we're going to get the same LSP support within the Neovim configuration so that when you're writing code, you get the same LSP that you would if you were using any other IDE. For example, in the case of TypeScript, we'll be using TS server. That's the same thing that is being used in VS Code. And then Python, we're going to use Pyrite. We're going to use the Lua language server for Lua. In order to install all of these, we're going to need to install a few things from the command line because these language server protocols rely on some languages and package managers. Specifically, we're going to be installing Lua rocks for Lua, npm as well for a number of the LSPs that we're going to be installing. We need to install the Golang language, and finally we need to install Python VN. We can do that by installing using these commands. So in the case of Golang, it's sudo apt install golang-go. In this case of npm, sudo apt install npm. In the case of Python, specifically we want this Python 3 version, so Python 3.10 VN, and then also Lua rocks. I've already got all of these installed, so you need to go through and install each of them. You'll be prompted for your password. Go ahead and install those, and then we'll be ready to go. Specifically, now we want to add in the Mason plugin manager, and Mason is a plugin manager that allows us to install these LSPs and linters and servers and debuggers and formatters. Let's go into our Vim configuration, and just like with all of the other plugins, we want to create a file called mason.lua. I've already got this set up here, and you can take my configuration, which is based, of course, off the official documentation. They've got an example down here for Lazy Nvim. I've added a few more options, including the command so that we can reference this using Mason, and then also the buffer read pre, so that is telling Mason when to be invoked, as well as this config for icons. which is based on this example provided down here for the icons based on when we're installing a language, whether it's pending, whether it's installed, whether it's uninstalled. We need to source our config now that we've got this new file. So let's go and source using so and then sourcing our config nvim init.lua file. Now if we open Lazy, you may see that your Mason is not yet installed. In the case of mine, it's already been installed. Shift-I, if you recall, will install it. We've got Mason here, and now we can call Mason or open Mason's UI using the colon and then Mason command. In here, we're going to see a list of all of the available LSPs, linters, debuggers, and formatters. I've already got Lua installed. I'm just going to remove that so we're both starting from the same start point. To get started, let's just install the Lua language server and then a linter and a formatter for Lua. We can always then add onto that in an iterative approach. It'll be a little bit easier to understand. We can search through all of the LSPs by using the / and then in this case I want to install the Lua language server. Once I've found it, hit enter and then press I, which will install that language server. I also want to install Lua. And finally, I want to install the linter, which is Lua check. We can go to the top and we'll see that this is being installed, notably using Lua rocks, which we installed via the command line just a moment ago. And now we've got these installed and we can click enter on each of these and it'll tell us what they are. So Lua check is the linter, Lua is a Lua formatter, and the Lua language server is an LSP. The difference between these is that an LSP gives us information pertaining to the language, so we can hover on variables, we can see type checking and so forth, whereas a linter is telling us how best we can style our code or the way in which our code should be written and giving us hints. In the Mason documentation, you'll see under extensions that Mason LspConfig.nvim is the recommended plugin for usage with LspConfig. LspConfig is where we're going to be configuring our language server protocols. So we're going to install Mason LspConfig just before we set up our LspConfig. There isn't an example for Lazy Nvim, but we know that this is quite straightforward. We're going to edit another file, once again in that same Lua plugins, and we're going to simply call this Mason LspConfig.lua. I've got a configuration already set up. The most important thing to note in here is simply the ensure installed. One thing that I forgot to mention earlier is that we're going to be using EFM. That's why we install Go, because Go is a dependency of EFM. And EFM we're going to use as a general language server protocol, and we're going to use it for all of our linting and formatting. It'll make sense a little bit later, but for the moment we need to also add EFM. Now, if you see there is the table which is ensure installed, and then I've got automatic installation true. So we can put any of our languages in here, and the next time we open up Neovim, we will see these automatically get installed. We can test that out because we haven't yet installed EFM. So let's exit out of Neovim and let's go back in. We'll see that Mason is immediately invoked, and Mason is going to be installing the Mason LspConfig, which has now been installed. If we go to Lazy and we go to load, we can go to Mason LspConfig. And let's have a look at our Mason to see if EFM was installed. As we can see here, EFM, which we hadn't previously installed, was automatically installed because it's in our list of ensure installed language server protocols. It's time to configure our LSP for Lua, and we're going to use that using nvim LspConfig. We've already installed the Lua language server, and we've installed a formatter and a linter for Lua. Now what we need to do is we need to configure these. And This is going to involve a lot of code. We're going to be pulling things in from different places, and we've got dependencies, but I'm going to walk you through a configuration for a single language, being Lua, and then we're going to add Python and then later TypeScript, and you can see how we can build upon our configuration with different languages that you may be working with. Let's add a new file, and this is going to be nvim LSPconfig.lua. In here, I've got a configuration set up for a single language. On the right-hand side, we have documentation pertaining to nvim LSPconfig, but all of this I will talk through here in the code, so I'm going to close that for now. At the top, we've got our config function. At the bottom, we've got our GitHub URL, and we're passing in the config function. We're not lazy loading this, and we have a few dependencies. Nvim auto pairs, which automatically inserts braces for example, opening bracket will then have a corresponding closing bracket. Mason, which we have just installed. And then also the efm-ls configs. And this is a set of configurations for many different languages. I'd highly recommend checking out the GitHub, which I will leave in the video description along with all the other links. This we're going to be using for our linting, and I can say that this, with the recent archiving of null-ls, is a good alternative if you are looking for that. So let's go to the top and let's walk through the code. The first thing that our config function does, and if you recall, each time that this plugin or any plugin is called, the config function is called at that time. The first thing that we're doing is we're requiring LSPconfig. Then we're setting some signs which will help with our diagnostics. This just makes the diagnostics a little bit prettier, and you can basically ignore this code, but I'd recommend including it if you would like some signs for hints and warnings and info. Next, we're setting up our Lua language server. The Lua language server is going to, for the moment, not get past any capabilities or on attach. We'll get into that later when we get into auto completion, but it is going to have a few more options, including the global Vim. We've been referencing the global Vim object, and here we want to make sure that this is recognized by the language server. Otherwise, we'll get an error saying, what is Vim? Where in fact it's a global variable that we are using within our configuration, and then some basic settings with respect to our workspace. In the next step, we're going to get Lua check and style Lua, and we installed these using Mason. If you recall, Lua check is the linter and style Lua is the formatter. And finally, we're going to set up EFM, which is our general purpose language server, and this is going to be what we're going to use for all of our document formatting as well as our linting. So the way that this works, and it's going to be the same pattern for each of these, we're going to use the efm-ls configurations, which is a dependency that we've stipulated at the bottom of this file, and we're going to grab out of that the Lua check and the style Lua configurations. So in file types, we have the Lua file type, and we're going to be able to add to that, for example, with Python files or TypeScript files, as we'll get into a little bit later. Then we have a bunch of options, which means what are we going to make available for this language server? I've got everything activated for the moment, and the most important things here are document formatting and then completion. Later we'll get into that. Under settings, we've got a table of languages, and at the moment we just have Lua. Finally, we've got a function right down the bottom, and what it does is it formats on save. So any of the language files that are using this EFM language server and which have a formatter passed in here, which in this case, if you recall, style Lua is our formatter, it's going to check to see if the active client is EFM. And if it is, then it's going to format using EFM and what we've set in EFM. In the case of Lua, we've set style Lua. In the case of other languages, we haven't set anything yet, so nothing will work. Finally, we've got our URL to the GitHub. We've got our config that we're passing in. We're not going to lazy load, so this is always going to be loaded immediately when we open Neovim. And we've got a few dependencies that I've already walked through. And the next time that we go to our Neovim, everything's going to install for us. Now, what we can do is we can have a look in any of our files, for example, our init.lua, and we can use the :lsp info to see which language servers are attached. And in this case, we can see that the Lua language server is attached, and also EFM, which is our formatter and linter general purpose language server. So in this file specifically, there's no warnings, but if we were to go to one of our other plugins, this Mason LSP config file does not have the correct spacing. And so when we write this, we'll find that it removes those spaces. It's auto formatting based on the star Lua formatter. Those warnings were based on the star Lua and the Lua linter, Lua check, that's called. And so as we go through our code, we're going to see more and more warnings. In this case, you can see that we have a bunch of warnings in here. And in a moment, we're going to set keymaps so that we can quickly move to those specific warnings to see what they're referring to and get a little bit more information. So before we can make the most of our LSP for Lua that we've just installed, and we can see all the warnings being thrown up by the linter at the moment, we need to set some keymaps so that when we load Lua or the Lua LSP server, we can quickly look at the different diagnostics and information that that LSP is providing to us, and also that the linter is providing to us. The plugin that I use to complement these shortcuts is called LspSaga.nvim. And if you want to get more information, there is a dedicated website. Otherwise, the GitHub repository is quite bare. As you can see here on line 14, I've declared a new function, and it's called onAttach. What it does is it enables key bindings for when an LSP server is available or active. So when we go to a Lua file or a Lua buffer, then it's going to load Lua LSP, and it's going to attach all of these keymaps so that we can see, for example, hover doc information, one of my favorite key bindings, or we can go to the next code action, or we can look at the definition, whatever it may be. So we're going to install that. The way that we would do that is we need to go to create a new file, which I've already done, and that was called LSPSaga. And in here, I've just got a basic configuration, nothing too crazy. All it does is install and set lazy to false, and then it's got a few key mappings. So for example, I always use Control K and Control J to move up and down. So that will install LSPSaga, but there is one more step to it. You will need to use ts install, and you will need to install Markdown and also Markdown inline. These are requirements for LSPSaga to be able to correctly render the LSP feedback that it's giving us. Once you've got this installed, then you'll be able to use all of these shortcuts for the Lua server, because that's the only server that we've got set up at the moment. For example, we can use Shift K, which I've already alluded to, which is hover doc. If we go up 9 lines, then we can see that this is mapped to Shift K, and it's LSPSaga hover doc, which would be the command that we'd have to enter if we hadn't mapped this key binding. Here we can simply use Shift K, and we get a view of the function signature. Obviously, in this case, the function is declared right above, but you can imagine in larger code bases or where we're importing functions, this saves us having to go to the specific definition of that function. And it also has automated documentation, so we can see that the comment that I've left just above the onAttach function states that it's to enable keybinds only for when LSPSaga, the specific LSP server is available. So that's all been set up, but you're still getting a lot of warnings. For example, if we use leader ND, we can go to our next diagnostic, and we can continue to do that. That's one of the key bindings which has been set in here. And we can see that it's saying that it doesn't know what this undefined variable Vim is. In fact, Vim is a global variable, which we have also set in this Lua setup under the Lua LspConfig configuration. Lua in this case isn't identifying that, or rather the linter is not identifying that as a global. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and we're going to have a look into our file explorer. Quickly before we do that, I will just mention way back in the beginning we installed Lazy, and when we installed it, it also came with another plugin called Neoconf. Neoconf is a configuration plugin for your global and project local settings. You can have a little bit more of a look into this, But the requirement is for this to work, as per the documentation that you see here, is that we need to require this before we run the Lua ls setup function, or we run the LSPconfig language server setup function for any other language server. So shortly we're going to be installing Pyrite and TS server, and they are also going to be need to be set up after this. So this on line 2 is being set up in line with this documentation guideline. Okay, so I'm just going to exit out of that, and we're going to go to our file explorer. You will see that I've got a few files here that I've named with .back to deactivate them. So I'm just going to reactivate them. So we're going to have a look in a moment into these. The first one is LuaCheck. This is telling LuaCheck, our linter, to, in my case, I want it to ignore a few of these errors that I don't find that helpful. And Lua does have a great numbering system for its errors, so we can simply list them in here and they will be ignored by the linter. And it's also saying that we have this global variable Vim. The next one is the Lua RC, and so we've also listed Vim under the Diagnostics globals in here. Finally, as I just mentioned, we've got a neoconf.json, and it just has a few basic settings, including, for example, which language server is enabled. Let's go to exit out of Vim just to reset everything. And now when we go to that file, which is our LSPconfig, Nvim LSPconfig, we'll see that all of our Vim issues have gone away. And in fact, when we hover on Vim, we're going to be given this list of global Vim properties. And this is super helpful for when we're developing, because this means that we've got way more insight into what that global Vim object actually is. We've also got another warning here on this line, which says that LuaCheck is using an unused argument called client. We can ignore that for now because we're going to be using client a little bit later with TS server and Pyrite. Now that we've got Lua ls set up, it's time to install Pyrite, which is the LSP that I'm going to use for Python. So we're going to use Mason, and in here we're going to go and we're going to install 3 of these LSPs, or in fact one is an LSP, which is Pyrite, one is a linter, which is Flake 8, and then one is a formatter, which is Black. So we can search here for Pyrite. You can hit enter just to confirm. Okay, yeah, this is the Python LSP. Let's hit I. Then we'll go to Flake 8. Yeah, okay, so that's a linter. Let's install that. And then finally Black, and that's the formatter. So the same process that we were going through with the Lua ls. Let's go to the top, make sure that they're all installed. Looks good. Now we can exit that, and just like we did with our Lua ls, we're going to set up our Pyrite on our LSP config. So if you see above, this was our Lua ls, and now we've got Pyrite. I've got a few settings that I'm going to pass in there, and we are going to be using the efm-langserver once again for our formatting and our linting. We can copy those two, and instead of LuaCheck, we are going to be using Flake 8, and instead of star Lua, we're going to be using Black. So we can simply change this to Black, and in here we can change this to Flake. We need to add Python to our list of supported file types on the efm-langserver, and then in here we can simply say Python equals, and here we can put Flake 8 and Black. So as you can see, setting up the first language server was a little bit complicated, but now that we've got everything working, we can install more and more. Now, just before we move on, I want to show you that right back at the beginning, I mentioned we would create a utils directory, and in that utils directory, we would use reusable code or somehow isolate code to make things a little bit more readable. This file is getting large, and so I've actually removed the onAttach function, and I've placed it into the util and a file designated for the LSP utilities called LSP. We can see this file in the File Explorer if we go to our File Explorer and then Utilities, and here we have the keymaps that previously existed directly in the LSPconfig setup file. It's a bit cleaner to have them here because we can reason about them in a single place. Convention is that we use this capital M for a table, and then we can attach functions to that table and return it. In the case of Pyrite, there is an additional option that we can use, which is organize imports. So that calls this Pyrite organize imports, and that's why earlier we had this client that we were passing to make sure that we could have checks in place for when we had a specific file. In this case, we're looking at a Python file, and we could add or attach even more keymaps. So we can go back and using our shortcuts, we could both hover on this import, or if we wanted to go and look at it directly, we could use lead G capital D, and it would take us directly to that import definition. This is super handy when we're moving around the code base. And here we had a hello world file. So let's open that hello world file and see how it looks. So immediately we are getting some warnings. Flake 8, which was the linter, is telling us that we're expecting 2 blank lines after a class or a function definition. So here on line 3, there should in fact be 2 lines. But of course, we can just write this file which will automatically call format, and it's fixed everything for us. If we wanted to import something like, let's say, import OS, we can see it's immediately telling us that's unused. But if we go to OS and we hover on it, we can see all of the documentation pertaining to OS. So Pyrite is working, and that's obviously super useful. We are back in our Neovim configuration, and we're going to set up auto completion. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to use this Nvim CMP plugin, and that is going to allow us to attach auto completion capabilities to all of the language servers that we instantiate in our LSP config. Got all the documentation here, and I'm going to paste in the standard configuration that I use. Just like on the right hand side, we are using this Nvim CMP, but we're also attaching a few other CMP Lua snip for Lua snippets, and also LSP kind. These are additional dependencies that I'm using, and if you go to the bottom of the file, you will see these made available there. This configuration file has simply got a bunch of different mappings and sources, and they're pretty straightforward. So for example, we've got Control K and J again, so that we can move up and down our selections, as well as a few other shortcuts, formatting, and so forth. Best is probably just to demonstrate how this works, but the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually attach it to each of our language servers. So if we go back to our LSP config, you can see here that I am requiring CMP Nvim LSP, and I'm getting this capabilities, default capabilities property. And for example, on Lua, I'm going to attach it, and also on the Python file. Now, both of these language servers should, in theory, have auto completion or completion available. Let's go and quit out, and we're going to CD back to the directory where we were and have a look at that Python file and see how the autocomplete is working. It's going to install some of those dependencies that we just listed out when we installed the Nvim CMP. That looks okay. Now let's import OS, and let's try and use OS. Immediately you can see OS has got all of these different functions available, and these are listed for us, including a quick summary on the right hand side of the function. You also might have seen that if we said import sys, and just while we're here, we're just going to test out that space OI, and you can see that even though this is a bit of a mess and we're not using any of these, we did manage to organize our imports, which was an additional API that we could call on the Pyrite language server. It's time to install TypeScript. So the TS server, which is the language server protocol, and then I'm going to be using ESLint as the linter and Prettier as the formatter. However, at the time of recording, the version of Node.js that Ubuntu 22.04 ships with is very old. In fact, it's so old that TypeScript no longer supports it. Specifically, it's version 12.22.9. What we need to do is we first need to install TypeScript. We can do that by running the command sudo npm, which we installed earlier. I stands for install, G which means global and then TypeScript. All right, so it's installed correctly, but it is giving some warnings saying that there's an unsupported bad engine, because earlier I actually installed Node.js using this command, and this gave us this very old Node.js version. On the right hand side here, we've got Nvim. If you're a Node.js developer or you work with TypeScript, JavaScript, you're going to be familiar with this. And in here, we've got a script on how to set it up. So we're going back to using our trusty curl command. We can, just for safekeeping, run this in the home directory. So all it's going to do is it's going to download NVM, which is this POSIX compliant shell script, and it's going to run the script, and that's going to put some additional code into your bash.rc file, which is going to allow for NVM to run. And NVM, essentially all it does is it allows us to determine which version of Node that we want to run. So let's run this. It's giving us some instructions here. We may need to close and open our system, but actually what we need to do is just source our .bashrc file. Now we should be able to use nvm i 20, and it's going to install the latest long-term stable version, which is 20.8.0. So now when we run node version, we're going to get this far more up-to-date version. We can change back into the nvim config directory. cd- just allows us to change back into the most recent directory that we were in. And then in here, we can simply start getting to work on our Mason configuration. We're going to install it in the same way that we did with Pyrite and with the Lua language server. We simply open Mason with the :mason command. And in here, we can search for TypeScript language server. So I'm going to install that. At the same time, I'm also going to install ESLint, and I'm going to use D, which is the daemon. We can install that with I, and then we can install Prettier as well. Whether we use Prettier or Prettier D, I'm going to go with Prettier D. Prettier D is installed, ESLint is installed, and these two are quite important because we're going to use them for a lot of different files, or ultimately you're going to be using them for a lot of different JavaScript and CSS and all kinds of different files. So they're installed, and so is the TypeScript language server. Until now, I've kind of brushed over the fact that we're using the EFM language server. I'll get into a little bit more depth on how exactly this is working and what the efm-ls configs are doing for us. But first things first, we're just going to have a look at our LSP config. Much like in the case of Python, we're simply going to call LspConfig TS server. In case you're confused, you can go back to Mason for a moment, and if we go to our TypeScript language server, we can see that even though it was called TypeScript language server in here, it's actually referred to as the TS server, and we can see that right here. So in case you're ever confused about how we can refer to a specific server, then you can always check it in Mason. I've set up the TypeScript server. It's got some basic configurations in here. And now we also need to set up our linter and formatter. So let's have a look. We're going to use ESLint D for the linter, Prettier for the formatter. Now in here, we're going to need to advise the EFM server that we're going to be using TypeScript. And then down here, it's going to ask for the linter and the formatter. Let's create a TypeScript file. So let's just call it index.ts. Let's go and use that index.ts file and see what kind of support we get. So if we go to LSP info, we can see we've got TS server attached here, and we've also got efm-langserver. Just getting back into the efm-langserver. efm-langserver isn't built specifically for Neovim, but what it allows us to do is to use the executable language or any of the supported languages in order to get linting and formatting. And you can see a list of all the supported languages in here. What we've been doing until now is we've been importing the pre-configured language options from this GitHub repository efm-ls, which is a dependency in our LSPconfig file. And what this efm-ls configs
Nvim does is it has the configuration set up for us, and it can be interesting just to have a look at these configurations so that we understand what's happened. Let's have a look at the linters. Say in this case we want to have a look at ESLint, and so here you can see that this is what's being passed into the EFM language server, and it's essentially providing it with the linter name, which is ESLint, and the daemon version denoted by the _d, and then it's giving it an executable, which in this case is going to be that ESLint-d, and then providing it arguments like you would in the command line, and then giving it some formats on how it should be formatting any warnings and errors out. So this is basically an interface that allows us to use TypeScript, or to use Lua rocks, or to use Python, and then pipe all of that information for formatting and linting into Neovim via the EFM language server. This language server, the efm-langserver, is incredibly important. Previously, people were using null-ls to achieve this same result. There is also another option called nvim-lint that you can look into. This, however, is however. So we can see down the bottom we've got our configured servers list, but fortunately this has detected that we are in a TypeScript file, and therefore we should only be loading TS server and EFM. That's good. So let's quit out of that and let's just start using some TypeScript to see what kind of support that we get. First thing we can do is we can declare a function, and we can just call this hello world. We can see that we're getting auto completion, so console.log, and we can see what console.log takes, and it takes any kind of data, but we're just going to say hello world. And then we can perhaps do some funny things in here. So we might say use a var, and we can use the diagnostics to see that, okay, TypeScript is telling us that this is not being used. How about if we give this a return type of number, and we can see that it's telling us, well, you're not returning anything. So overall, you can see that TypeScript is working. A few last comments with respect to setting up your LSP config. If you recall, we did have this auto format command down here, this auto format on save, and I would argue that as this file gets lengthier and lengthier, it may get lost. So what you can do instead is you can grab that autosave, and in your config up there on the left, we're going to create a new file called autocmds.lua. And here you can add any auto commands. If we recall, in this case, this auto command just auto formats on pre-write, and it checks if EFM is an active server, and then if it is, then it goes and formats it asynchronously. If you ever have any issues with your formatting, or you add additional auto commands, you'll know where to find them. It's important that you go into your init file in your config and you add this line, which is config auto commands. You need to require that file to ensure that it's being used. So we've added 3 language servers, and as you can see, it's quite easy to add additional language servers. Or you need to pick up the linters and formatters for each specific language, or in some cases the language servers themselves have some capabilities like formatting, so you can simply go and look at the documentation for the languages that you use and you can add them. We've got settings that we've been passing to all of these languages, and I just want to point out that there is one thing that you can look up. So if we go to Mason, we can go to any of the language servers, and keep in mind this is only for language servers, and underneath the language servers, if we hit enter, we'll also see this additional section, which is LSP server configuration. What this is, it tells you all of the settings that you can pass to that language server, including the default configurations. So if you ever want to explore additional settings for specific language servers, all of these language servers that we've installed have additional settings, some of which we've used. Of course, just to show you that, for example, Lua check, which is a linter, it doesn't have any of these available. So it's only for language servers. The last plugin that we're going to be installing is called Transparent Nvim. And what this does is it allows you to have transparency in your Neovim session, and it also requires that your terminal has transparency turned on. As you can imagine, if Neovim's transparent but
the terminal itself isn't, then you won't get the benefit of this plugin. As we've done with all of the other plugins, we're simply going to go to our plugins directory and we're going to create a file, and it's going to be called transparent. I've already created a file and it's got a bunch of different settings. All of these can be found here in the documentation. But it's also important to note that because we've got Lualine installed, this shows us where our buffers are and the file types and the percentage down the page we are, as well as our Vim mode. We also want to set this setting here to Statusline and set the background to 0. This is important because it'll give you transparency within your Lualine. Then we can simply follow the instructions provided by the plugin here in the documentation on GitHub, which gives you a bunch of different groups that are simply classifiers for different UI components within Neovim, and we're going to be setting all of these to transparent. There is one more thing that we're going to do before we finish up with the transparency plugin though, and that is that we need to go to our Nvim tree file, and in here we're also going to set the Nvim tree normal classifier to be none. And this is important because then your file explorer is going to be transparent. Whereas if you don't have that set and you don't have the Lualine set, you will have a transparent pane here, but you will not have transparency in your file explorer or in Lualine. We're almost there, but we need to go and adjust, in our case, in this example, Alacrity, which is the terminal emulator, or in your case, whichever terminal emulator that you're using. So I'm going to exit out. As you can see at the moment, I've turned opacity here off just for demonstration purposes. But what we can do is we can go to our Alacrity config, which is going to be in the .config and then Alacrity and alacrity.yml file that we created at the beginning of the tutorial. In here, we can simply set our opacity. So I'm going to set mine to 0.85, or perhaps let's try 0.9, and immediately you can see that the opacity, even though we're in Neovim right now, has been activated because Alacrity has picked up on this configuration change. So we can look at our file explorer just to make sure that is also transparent. That's looking good. And we can go to any of our files, say this file, and we might go and have a look at Vim on hover. Okay, that transparency is working as well. In this final section, we're going to set up TMUX with Neovim. TMUX is an incredible powerful utility, and this is only going to be a brief snapshot of its capabilities. As usual, you can always refer to the documentation, and I will take you through my configuration and all of the key bindings and show you how to get it set up and working with Neovim. TMUX is a terminal multiplexer, so it allows us to have sessions, windows, and panes. And we've got a few plugins that I'm going to show you how to use to have persistency between sessions. It ultimately embeds or works extremely well with Neovim, and that's why I opt for TMUX with respect to my terminal usage rather than having a terminal plugin in Neovim. In order to set up TMUX, you're going to have to run the command sudo apt install TMUX. I've already got it installed, but go ahead and install it. One other thing that you'll need to install, much like we did with Lazy Nvim, is you'll need to install the TMUX plugin manager. The TMUX plugin manager, as you can imagine, is going to help us install some useful plugins to make our experience with TMUX slightly better and enable us to apply a theme to TMUX. And so go ahead in the GitHub repository in the link attached to this video, have a look at this clone TPM, and all you need to do is put that into your terminal and run this command. You'll see I've already got it installed, and so it's going to fail, but in your case it will set up the TMUX plugin manager. Most modern tools use the .config directory to manage the configuration files, and TMUX is no different. You can have a .tmux.conf file in your home directory, or you can create a TMUX directory, much like we've done with Neovim, in the .config directory. So go ahead and create a TMUX directory with make-dir TMUX. I've already got one, but you won't, so go ahead and create that. Then cd into that TMUX directory. And in here, you can create a new file, which we're going to call tmux.conf. And TMUX, much like Neovim, is smart enough to look in this location to see the configuration file. When you've created the file, let's open up our Neovim and we'll go to that specific file. I'm going to close this window on the right so that we've got a little bit more viewing space. And in front of you, you're going to see the configuration that I use for TMUX. I'm going to walk you through it, but it isn't actually that extensive. Most of the configuration is done within Neovim, and most of what we're doing here is just around TMUX theming and also the ability to navigate in between the TMUX panes. Alright, so the first setting just enables us to have color in the terminal and we can set theming. And then the next section talks about the default prefix. So whenever we want to make a TMUX command, we simply need to call this prefix followed by the shortcut that we wanted to make in order to call that key binding. So by default, this is Control B, but a lot of people find it a little bit easier to map it to other letters, and for myself, I use Control A. So TMUX will always be listening, and if it hears Control A followed by something else, it will then execute that key binding. I also remap the window splitting. I think that it's kind of intuitive to think that the pipe symbol, if we use our prefix, which in my case is Control A and then pipe, will split the windows in two, and that if we were to use the dash as in a vertical line, that's going to split them vertical. I'll give you a demonstration a little bit later. Then if we want to reload our config, I've mapped that to prefix, Control A, and then R, and that simply just reloads our config anytime we make any changes. There's a few resize pane shortcuts that I've got here, as well as shifting between windows. I've enabled the mouse and also set a scroll back limit, which by default is 20,000, and I've increased that to 50,000. So if you ever have a huge amount of output in the terminal, then you'll be able to have a longer history and scroll back further. I enable the Vim motion so that we can copy anything from the terminal in the visual or Yanked modes. And then finally, I've enabled mouse dragging. That can help sometimes if you want to shift a pane or resize a pane and so forth. There's a few plugins here. So the first one, as we know, is going to be the TMUX plugin manager. And then also, importantly, the Vim TMUX navigator. We're going to install in our Neovim config one last plugin, and that is by the same author as this plugin, and that's going to allow us to shift between windows that are Neovim or are TMUX terminals. There's also a theme pack, and then Resurrect, which allows us to persist sessions after restarting, and Continuum, which saves those sessions every 15 minutes. There's a few other settings, as well as a very basic theme pack that I've applied called Powerline Default Gray, and you can go and do your own research and see what you like. In order to install this, we're just going to use our prefix, which is Control A and then Shift I, so Shift I being install, and then everything will be installed. Now we can quit out of this and we can start a TMUX session. The way that we do that with TMUX and then S for session or new S, and then we can give it a name. I'm just going to call it example. Now you'll see down the bottom of the screen it says TMUX resurrect file not found. That's because this is a totally fresh install and we haven't been using TMUX. But now that that's disappeared, you're going to see our TMUX Powerline theme showing us the status line down the bottom. You can see the session that we're in, you can see the user, the time, the date, and the operating system. So we're not yet in Neovim, but we already have a view into this TMUX session. We can use TMUX list sessions, and that's going to show us how many sessions that we have available. I definitely encourage you to do your own research with respect to how to manage your TMUX sessions, windows, and panes, but I'm going to demonstrate how we're going to use TMUX in the context of Neovim. I'm going to change back into our Neovim directory, and I'm going to start Neovim. Nothing's really changed. Now that we've got the Powerline status line for TMUX down the bottom, I don't want to pollute it too much down in that space. So we've designated the Lualine to be at the top, and we've got the TMUX status line at the very bottom. As I mentioned, we've got a few key bindings, and I'm going to quickly walk through those. But before we get to that point, I just need to point out that we've also implemented a few minor changes in our Neovim configuration. One of those under plugins is the TMUX navigator. This is, as I mentioned, by the exact same author as the plugin where we installed the navigator within the tmux.conf file. So it's important that we've got it installed in both places because it's going to allow us to navigate between TMUX terminals and our Neovim. I've also added a few key bindings. So if we use our fuzzy finder to go to that file and we can go to Keymaps, then in here you're going to see additional pane navigation, which really pertains to pane and window navigation. All these do is allow us to integrate our shortcuts, which are Control and then H, J, K, or L to shift between our panes in this case, as we going back towards the beginning, to shift between the file explorer and shift between files or split files, for example. So if we were to use leader SV, we know that that's going to allow us to split this, but this is all within the one TMUX window. What we can also do is we can split this and allow us to have an additional pane down the bottom, which is going to be a terminal. So I'm going to use the prefix, which is Control A. So Control A and then dash is going to show a terminal down the bottom. We still only have one window, but we've got multiple panes. In fact, we've got two. We've got a Neovim pane and we've got a TMUX terminal pane. And so going back to what I mentioned earlier, I've got some resize shortcuts. So once again, prefix A and then K allows us to make the terminal larger. Prefix A and then J makes it smaller. We can also split it vertically. So prefix and then pipe allows us to two terminals down the bottom. So you can immediately see that this is quite useful when it comes to having terminals and also integrating with Neovim. Finally, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new window. We do that with prefix and then C. And now you can see that you've got two different windows down the bottom, and we can navigate between these with prefix and then 0 if we wanted to go to the first one, or prefix and then 1 if we want to go to the second one. We can rename these with prefix and then comma, and I'm going to call this window 2 just as an example. And then finally, we can rename our entire session with prefix and $sign. So we may want to call this end of config prefix D. This is going to detach us from our TMUX, and we can now add a new session or reattach to the last one. If we want to create a new one, though, in the example that I was giving, we can use the same command, new s, and we'll just say we've got a new challenge now that our Neovim configuration is all set up, and we can now list our TMUX sessions with this command, TMUX list session, and you can now see that you've got two. One of the key bindings that's quite handy is prefix W, and that shows you the windows that you've got available. You can move up and down with J and K between them, and then ultimately you've now got the ability to use the terminal via TMUX and using Neovim. Of course, TMUX is incredibly powerful, and I definitely encourage you to look even more in depth at the configuration, but that summarizes its integration that I use with Neovim. So congratulations, you've set up your Neovim config. It has many plugins, but they're all working correctly. You've got auto saving, you've got a file explorer, you've got LSP support, linting and formatting, and you can add any languages that you'd like. I appreciate you watching this video, and if you've got any feedback or languages that you'd like to see, other plugins or other configuration options, then please let me know. Thanks.